All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. We may have a few more folks join us, but really appreciate everyone joining us and hopping on early. So welcome. This is our second webinar that we're doing at KUNGFU.AI. I'm Jennifer True, I'm the Director of Marketing, and today's topic is about building your internal AI capabilities. We really wanted to focus on this topic because while a lot of people know about the potential and sort of the end game of AI, the road to go from start to finish is often really muddy, really unclear. Not a lot of people talk about the things they've tried and failed at, and no one's really sharing that look back. So we're hoping to use that as a moment to help educate people about the path forward. A couple housekeeping notes. Everyone is on mute, but please feel free to pop into the chat or the Q&A if you have any questions during the webinar. We'll hold about 10 to 15 minutes afterwards to answer some questions. And if you haven't yet, please do take our poll questions about your investment and your use cases that you've got planned. So with that, I'd like to welcome Steve Meyer, co-founder, Chief Creative Officer of KUNGFU.AI. And Steve, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Jennifer, and howdy, everyone. I'm actually really happy and excited to have this conversation with you today. It's such a fascinating subject, and in our position, working with different clients in different industries now, we have made so many interesting observations and have written extensively on the topic. But today, I call this a AI 201, maybe 301 level topic, where we're not talking about the merits of looking at artificial intelligence as a capability or an emerging technology or just a one-off project to try in the business. We're really graduating beyond that topic and getting into the core of should I and how do I scale AI programs across my business, and how do I make it a core function of everything that we do, which is really a big and profound topic. It's interesting because taking a step back and observing what's going on in industry right now, if you just do a light search on Google or LinkedIn, what you'll notice is a tremendous uptick in machine learning and AI being put in people's titles. And we're not just talking about data scientists and engineers here. We're seeing AI and machine learning titles all across the business, from entry level to even executive, technical and non-technical roles. So something more profound is going on here than seeing AI simply as an R&D project or as an emerging technology or as a one-off fun experiment. Companies are really leaning in to artificial intelligence as a core component of their business, much like businesses leaned into internet and IT in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, getting there is not easy, and there's going to be a process ahead. And what we hope to do today is really outline some of the things that are becoming essential as businesses lean in to artificial intelligence and how to go about that journey in a very thoughtful, pragmatic way. So to jump in first, a quick introduction. Jennifer mentioned, my name is Steve Meyer. I'm a co-founder of KUNGFU.AI and Chief Creative Officer. I've been in the technology sector for now going on 16 years. I've been exclusively in the Fortune 500 tech sector for the exception of 1 year where I spent as a high school history teacher. So now I've fashioned myself as an AI teacher of sorts, which I'm tickled to say because I have so much fun doing it. But I've been more on the creative side of the technology, where I've been more interested in trying to creatively identify emerging technologies and apply them to really practical business problems for a number of years. And I led a digital strategy team for close to a decade, really working across the Fortune 500 IT space, working with big clients like IBM, Dell, and HP, and helping them apply new digital technologies to solve a lot of marketing and IT challenges. And we started experimenting with artificial intelligence as a real capability that they can deploy and measure business value on back in that time, where we leveraged a lot of IBM Watson in really interesting and creative ways. So since then, I've achieved a certificate from MIT in the business implications of artificial intelligence. And my role here at KUNGFU is really on the strategy side, helping businesses understand what their AI strategy could and should be, and building really a roadmap of low-hanging fruit to more aspirational capabilities. And as a service provider, that's in part what we do. We provide that strategy, but we're also helping companies build bespoke solutions in key areas like computer vision, natural language processing, and predictive statistical modeling. And a big thing we do, which is really relevant to this conversation, is more on the transformation side, helping businesses learn artificial intelligence so we can teach it to them and ultimately allow them to become AI self-sufficient so they don't need partners and services providers to ultimately run and scale their programs. And this talk today is actually derivative of a paper we published back in late 2019 called Building Internal Artificial Intelligence Capabilities. So it's a great place to start if you want to dive just a little bit deeper on the topic after this presentation, but we'll also hopefully have a good conversation towards the end. I encourage everyone to check it out. Now, I want to start by saying artificial intelligence as an internal capability and your journey isn't black and white. It isn't, we tried it and we have it and we haven't and we don't. Some people who haven't tried artificial intelligence may be far along their journey, where others may be far behind but can quickly get started. We liken this to the process of martial arts, where mastering martial art isn't black and white. In fact, there are all different colors and levels along the way, and there's a maturation process one has to go through where skills build on one another. And it takes a lot of time and hard work and practice to get there. So don't think that there is a light switch solution here. Give yourself the time and grace to go through that maturation process, because it's very much like the Kung Fu system as you work towards your AI mastery. And the goal is to get so good at it, you can then give back and teach others how to do the same thing. So to kick things off, the reason why people are really leaning into it today, because there are plenty famously impactful examples going on in industry, but you're seeing them come out of Google and Facebook and Amazon and Tesla and Netflix. And those companies have been proven very successful, leveraging artificial intelligence and really keeping that technology core to their crown jewel, or where they are making most of their money. But when you look at artificial intelligence from a macroeconomics perspective, it's really, really interesting the type of activity we expect it to generate. So this is data coming out of McKinsey Global Institute last year, just surveying the economic impact of artificial intelligence. Now, starting as a history teacher, I find this very fascinating because they call artificial intelligence the fourth industrial revolution, the first three being the steam engine, robotic manufacturing, and then later the internet. And they're saying artificial intelligence is going to be eclipsing all three of them in total impact. So by 2030, we're estimating $13 trillion in economic activity, 1.2% additional GDP. And it's happening so fast and at such a scale, which is 10x the speed and 300x the scale of the Industrial Revolution, which is really mind-blowing. But then you wonder, how is that happening and where is it coming from? And it's not going to be coming from companies doing a bunch of one-off AI projects or this idea of technology tourism where people are just experimenting with it, throwing capabilities out there, seeing what sticks. It's going to be when businesses are actually leaning into it and really transforming their business around this fundamental data capability. Now, some of the drivers behind this, as many may know or may be surprised by, artificial intelligence, machine learning is in fact not new. It is approximately 90 years old, depending on how you look at it. But it seems like this is becoming very important overnight. And what's going on here? Well, we are seeing just a Cambrian explosion of data. We are having more data exhaust and intelligence being created all around us all the time, business and our consumers. And this is very useful information if we can harness it. But we are seeing the world's total accumulation of data being eclipsed almost every 2 or 3 years. So we are just surrounded in this information ripe for utilization. And data has been likened to the new oil. It is a natural resource in this sense, where artificial intelligence is really only useful with really good data. And you can have the same capability being used by two competitive businesses and see different outcomes. The winner is often decided by who has the superior data. So it's really important to both focus on the capability and the data. But like I said, artificial intelligence is not new, but what is new about it, where previous old algorithms that would be considered today still machine learning have a plateau where more data doesn't necessarily yield better intelligence or better results. But when you start seeing some of the recent advances in artificial intelligence, more data does mean better insights and better results. So now we can actually harness a lot of this data and not see a plateau in the capability. It can keep getting better and better. And what's really interesting, and this is a good segue into why people are so interested in this idea of building artificial intelligence capability, is that some of these things are actually exceeding human level performance. So in certain domains like speech and image recognition, you can see here, even in the last 5 years, the error rate from computers to machines, where computers 5 or 10 years ago were fairly ineffective at just recognizing basic images or basic speech patterns, where humans have been fairly consistent. 95% of the time, we're gonna get it right. But now we are seeing artificial intelligence and computer vision and NLP actually exceed the capabilities of human. And that is going to be happening all the time. We are gonna be adding newer and newer capabilities where the AI or the ML is going to be superior in certain tasks. So that becomes important when we're thinking about if we adopt this in our business. Now, the biggest difference today is a lot of companies are graduating from what I would call descriptive analytics to prescriptive analytics, where previously analytics was more about taking data. We've been doing this for a long time and trying to understand what happened. Why did an event of the past happen? But what we really are able to graduate from in the business is the basic analytics of looking at the past and analyzing it, which is often a very human sport, to making predictions about the future and even using automation to make recommendations on how to change that future. And the value is very obvious, right? Going from hindsight to foresight significantly increases the business value. So these are all going to be fundamentally ripe opportunities that businesses are leaning into. So let's get started. Where do we start? Well, it starts with things like culture. It starts with things like strategy when you want to build your own internal capability. So what you see here is a graphic that comes out of McKinsey Global Institute. And the thinking here is that I want to make an assessment across all industries and ask fundamentally 2 questions. First, are you adopting artificial intelligence in general? And if so, what machine learning capabilities are you leaning into by sector? So what you see here is a radar graph or a spider chart that shows different capabilities and has a stack ranking of all the industries and their likelihood of being or leveraging artificial intelligence across their business. So if you can see, it starts with high tech. At 78% of respondents say they're using artificial intelligence across the business. And it goes all the way down to infrastructure, where you can see underneath 36% will report using artificial intelligence across the business. But then you can see within the graphic, not only what types of artificial intelligence are being used, but the percent of survey respondents likely to say that that is a big core piece of their puzzle, right? So when we're going across, let's take a look at telecom, for example. So we're looking at telecom and we notice that virtual agents and conversational interfaces, approximately 50% of the telecom respondents say that's a core piece of what they're leaning into, where other areas like natural language and speech understanding are lagging behind a little bit. So every industry has a different story, and the size of this geometry will give you a sense of how much AI ML is permeating across these industries. So when you're thinking about your artificial intelligence competency and setting your strategy, it's good to understand where your industry is and what's being used successfully. It presents you a signal on where the starting point may lie. Because fundamentally, and I think the best way that I'm able to both wrap my head and communicate the value of artificial intelligence is using this old Air Force acronym, the OODA loop. Some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not, but it's actually a really simple construct on how we make decisions, right? We take in information and make an observation. Based on that information, we start to make sense of that information and make a decision. Once that decision is made on what to do with that information, we take an action and then trial and error, right? We learn from that decision and that action, observe the behavior, and the cycle begins again. Now, previously, that's been a very, very human sport, right? We can intake the information we can intake. We have the people who are capable of doing this successfully, and we are limited by those two things. Well, now with more data, we can make more observations because we just simply have more facts, more information, which if we can harness that information, we can start to orient around it and make better decisions and pointed, well executed actions, and then hopefully learn by the results, right? And where AI is allowing us to do this at a breakneck speed, really winners and losers in the AI economy are going to be defined on how fast they can move along this OODA loop. And companies with machine learning and without machine learning who are very competitive, you'll know will spin very fast in one direction and not so fast in another direction. That is a strategic disadvantage. So let me skip at the end of the slide where this encapsulates everything and observed in terms of where is it, what's important to embracing artificial intelligence capabilities. What are the key tenets? Within those tenets, what should we be thinking about? So it really breaks down to taking this idea of all of these siloed lines of business and really reformulating them and reconfiguring them into more in a disciplinary position and creating a new organization dedicated to data and artificial intelligence. And they have components of business, technology, data, a new system called learning, and it's all tied together by the appropriate culture and having the right people. So let me break this down for just a moment. First, on the business side, it's very important in artificial intelligence, let's say organization or department, you have strong representation from the line of business and business-minded folks, where they're going to be integral in setting the strategy and also identifying if the machine learning strategy is congruent with the corporate strategy and where the business is prioritizing their focus. Building business justifications, business cases, setting metrics to understand what success looks like as it pertains from ML to the corporate strategy becomes very important. But then there's also technology people, understanding that you've gone through the requisite digital transformation, trying to understand what technologies are important to not only starting AI projects, but scaling deployments across the organization, and try to understand when it comes to machine learning capability, where can I partner? Where do I need to build internally? And where can I buy from products that are available in market, which are nascent today, but will continue to grow in maturity? Start to understand your compute, storage, and data requirements to run any of these programs. And that's a really good transition into the data topic. Making sure that you guys are harnessing your data, fusing different myriad data sources together, understanding where the gaps are. There's always going to be gaps. How do we go and fill those gaps if we don't have the right information? Who's going to be in charge of going after and acquiring that data, creating dictionaries and ontologies, and ultimately establishing tooling that allows that data collection and the machine learning engineering and experimentation to take place, things like Docker, Kubeflow, and Jupyter. The learning is a new function where once you have models into production, there needs to be this AI command center where you're monitoring models into production and making sure that those capabilities are growing and thriving in their capability. So if you remember back to the graph where I showed you that when you add more data to deep learning models, we're actually seeing increased capabilities where previous models plateaued. The learning becomes a very human sport where we're setting up alerts and triggers and identifying when new data is coming in so we continuously retrain the model and monitor if the model is self-generalizing or getting smarter with new information. There's a human in the loop component where if the model makes a bad prediction or takes a bad action, the human can then tell it what the right answer was, and then the model can get smarter that way. This software, these APIs, this code is much closer to organic matter than it is static software in that it gets better with attention and it learns and grows and thrives with data and feedback. Whereas if you left it alone, it could wither and actually reduce in its capability. So this learning function becomes very, very critical. And finally, on the culture and people side, it's really important that you have a culture conducive to artificial intelligence, a well-educated executive level staff that can educate the rest of the organization, as well as making sure that we address any sort of ethical concerns, privacy concerns, fear of the technology in general, and have plans for things like automation, all topics we will touch on further in just a moment. But also being able to have governance, and once we create capabilities, change management. This is new technology for everyone. People are not used to using artificial intelligence to augment their role. So if I put this in the hands of people who are now required to use it to make their performance better or their job more effective, how do I teach them to do that? How do I make them comfortable with that workflow? Change management becomes very, very important. There are perils. If this looks easy to you, let's talk. That's an interesting perspective. There's a lot of reasons why these things can break down, and it's good to be able to spot those ahead of time and see around corners. Projects and programs are going to break down because the strategy is not set before you get started. You have the right people in-house or have the right partners established today. So you try and you think you can be self-taught, and it's not just working out so well. Data, 9 times out of 10, not having enough data, having too much data, having dirty data, all of these things become very challenging. The data can be very disparate and hidden in places that you may not know exist. We talked a little bit about culture and being able to lean in on things like R&D and being okay with failure and being able to test and learn hypothesis. Those are all important as a cultural function, but also making sure that you have a strategy. The business objectives are well aligned. Sometimes people can't agree on what should be the priority and where the business can go. It starts there. Understanding what technologies we do have, what data they are harnessing, and how we can break down some of those technology silos. And ultimately, at the end of the day, have a strong hypothesis on what use cases would actually drive measurable impact to the business. So I'm going to break these down just a moment. It really starts with strategy and culture. I talked about strategy. Let's talk about culture. So again, I mentioned a few of these, but when it comes to artificial intelligence, if you're very, very new to this, it's very important that the executive level has good understanding of what AI is and what AI is not. It's very hard to work around them or work somewhere down the chain and expect this to actually spread across the business. It's very important for those executives to be self-educated or to provide them that level of education so they can start to map the intersection between the strategies they put in place and what the technology enables. But it's also very important to make sure you have a room with a lot of different perspectives in it. So when you are formulating your strategy or list of projects, you need to have representation from executives. You need to have representation from technology, from data, from end users, from people closest to the problem you're trying to solve, and perhaps even customer perspective. All of those need to come together to make sure you're running through all the traps and avoiding pitfalls. It's also important to shift from this culture of experience-based or gut-based decision-making to making data-driven decisions. So if the business is already leaning into analytics, it might be a less steep climb than if you're not using basic analytics, and a lot of the decisions are just made by hiring very experienced people who've been there, done that, using their best intuition. I think data-based decision-making is really a fundamental crossroads you have to come through before you can actually really scale this thing. It's really important that the business explains to their people and the entire organization what is going on behind their investment in artificial intelligence, what they plan to do with it, and what they don't want to do with it becomes really important. That way you can really anticipate and have open conversations and dialogue with people who are concerned with ethics and concerned with their job being at stake, and remove any barriers and fears. And then again, it's not so much about top-down decision-making, but decision-making is going to be federated across the business. And it's going to be, some of these orientations and observations are going to be coming from the front lines, using data, and you're able to make decisions in a very collaborative way. And what's really interesting here is that from a lot of the data we see, your AI budget, if you want to scale this thing, will rival your IT budget. To give you a sense of how important this is, but also what it takes to truly get this thing off the ground at scale. Beyond that, all right, we have our culture, we have our people, or we have our strategy. Now we need to get the people. So we thought this would be a helpful artifact. We've actually taken our past experiences with large corporations who are doing this really well and our own personal experiences hiring at KUNGFU.AI, and we put together a job rack of what a chief AI officer would look like. So if you were going to hire one executive level person to set the strategy and really own the execution of your entire AI program, it approximately looks like this resume. So a lot of times people will think, let me hire a bunch of talented engineers, let me give them all the tools and resources at their disposal, give them a little peek under the hood of what we want them to accomplish, and they're going to be able to figure things out. Well, oftentimes that strategy fails for many reasons. And it's important to have more of a top-down approach where you have someone who's very ingrained with where the business is going, who's done a lot of the been there, done that activities in deploying machine learning capabilities in their past experiences, and ultimately can replicate that same success as a wide effort across a business. So zooming in on this just a little bit, the background of this individual, it's really important for them to have a interdisciplinary or a multifaceted background, which includes product, software, as well as consulting. So AI capabilities can be seen as something like a product launch or fall along a product roadmap, even though you might be using it as an internal capability, for example. So people who have the experience of first formulating a business hypothesis and a market analysis, and then looking for appropriate capabilities that are enabled by machine learning to build, deploy, and launch, and get those out in the hands of users, test and fail, measure success, bring those insights back, the OODA loop spins on and on. So it really requires someone who understands product, but also understands the blockers of software development, where many times machine learning models never make it into production because of software issues. So it's good to be able to see both sides of that. The consulting side is important in that people coming from a consulting world definitely understand how to build strategies and quickly learn new domains. But more importantly, it's just about making them an effective communicator. They need to be a translator. How do I translate the technical of my machine learning and engineering teams to my line of business executives who may be very less technical and have a hard time wrapping their head around this stuff? So it's also important they have experience setting product roadmap and strategy. Beyond that, from an educational standpoint, they may have a background in things like computer science or mathematics, and you're starting to see a lot more machine learning pop up in certificate and degree programs as well. Not a deal breaker, because a lot of this can be learned after the fact, but people who have a solid foundation in the computer science and the mathematics are a really good combination to be able to truly understand these capabilities. Some other notes that could be interesting is public speaking and publishing. So if people have a good track record of public speaking, I talked about the value of being able to communicate effectively, but are also well published, meaning that they can live in the theory, but they can also make it very practical and translate the theory to a business case. So building around a strong foundation around your people and knowing what roles to look for also become very important. So a couple of key roles that we've identified on our end that are important to the equation when trying to build your AI department or center of excellence. One is a data engineer. So this person conceptually is a researcher, a designer, and an implementer of machine learning applications, meaning that they understand the underlying technology to be able to assess what fundamental databases and data technology do I need to acquire to actually allow the machine learning to access the information, move the information around, and certainly get things into deployment. So this data engineer is really going to prepare your data pipelines. It's going to clean the data where necessary. It's going to aggregate different data sources together and fuse them in. They're also going to be very important to identifying what gaps may exist and perhaps how to go fill those gaps. Then there's going to be more senior roles that are going to be along the engineering front. So we call these principal or machine learning engineers, and their role is to take a lot of what has already been teed up by the data engineer and start to architect the actual solution. So they might be able to look into research and try to understand what is the latest and greatest in natural language processing, but also figure out how to apply that very practically to the business problem, and being able to test both things like deep learning techniques and traditional machine learning or linear techniques against one another. Because just because it's deep learning or it's in the cutting edge doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the best answer to solve the problem. Oftentimes there are many correct answers, and this person needs to be able to understand the wide landscape of capabilities to be able to test and compete capabilities against one another and allow versioning to ultimately get to the candidate model that ultimately shows the best propensity for actually achieving the business goal. Now, they're going to provide as a technical lead and probably manage people who are going to do a lot of the hard engineering using things like Python. And then there's this role called the AI product manager. Now, this person is going to be able to straddle the line between the business and the technical. So they might be able to handle several capabilities that are in flight. They're going to, in the very early days, be able to identify what problems we're trying to solve, and ultimately what type of solutions are out there to solve that problem. They're going to be able to help the data engineer, data wrangle, and break down communication silos between different departments and say, hey, CMO and CIO, you should talk. There's data we should be sharing here. And ultimately then define the success plan and the KPIs behind the actual AI capability, and then work with the team to develop the technical plan and manage the deployment and the go-to-market for that technical plan. So they're really seeing things from conceptualization all the way through go-to-market and feedback, cradle to grave. And then there's things like AI program managers. So depending on how big the business is, you may have multiple product managers that are trying to get capabilities into production, and a program manager who could be your chief AI officer, could function very similarly, being able to really see all of the capabilities from the macro level, really connect the forest for the trees from the strategy and how we're executing. This is a really fascinating graphic where this is more about process and organizational structure when organizing for AI. So this comes out of Harvard Business Review, and there was a fascinating report called Organizing AI for Scale. So what we're looking at here is more, it's not this tops-down decision tree looking or linear model in terms of decision making, but more of this agile, collaborative, federated model where the hub of the AI organization is really who owns the data and the strategy on where the program needs to go to solve the business problem. And that hub is going to also manage very technical people. So it might be managing your machine learning engineers and your data engineers. But what's really interesting about this spokes is that the people who are actually wrangling the data and building the capability according to HBR should be federated across the business, meaning they have accountability and reporting structures into the hub who's managing the strategy and the data, but they also are accountable and report to the line of business where they're embedded. So they may also report to the CMO or the COO or the CRO, and those individuals will have their own data engineers and machine learning engineers who understand their data and their needs and their world. So the strategy and the actual end users and the people most accountable to the performance of the ML capability are talking, and they have great subject matter expertise. So you can start to see the execution teams are deeply embedded into the spokes, which are the lines of business, but there's still a lot of collaboration and communication in between to ensure continuity with the total business effort. And part of this is important to understand that there's this issue in AI called the last mile AI problem. So you can have set yourself up famously well. You're following all of these steps. You've even created a hub and spoke model in terms of how the teams are constructed and embedded. You have your chief AI officer, but something's falling down. Oftentimes we hear from clients that they may be running 10 or 12 different capabilities that are in motion, but they're only able to get 2, 3, 4 of them into production. Part of the reason is the process breakdown between what we have on the data science side, the DevOps, and the software engineering side, where here lies the last mile AI problem. So ultimately, what we need to do is bridge the gap between the data science and the deployment. So getting our models, which are useful but not usable, packaged up into an interface that people can use who may be less technical, and then moving those things into production. So what you are seeing here is the total agile motion for AI development that starts with strategy and ends with deployment, but being able to connect the nodes between the data science and the DevOps, so these capabilities are known how to package and move into deployment. And once they're in deployment, they're easy to monitor and manage. So again, the model can increase in its capability, becomes really, really important. So it's very important to, again, focus on people who have skill sets on the data science side, but also the development side, and they're working hand in hand, or they exist perhaps as one person. Because once you get things in deployment, now you have this operations issue, where again, and we talked about this earlier, is you need this command center. And this command center is monitoring all the projects that are in deployment. It's thinking about versioning and testing different models into deployment. It's monitoring the output of those models, looking for anomalies if the performance is starting to drift, or if it's starting to increase, or just inherent changes in the data, trying to understand why and maximize the most positive outcome. So there's continuous feedback loops in people actually training these models on the correct decision, and really taking a close look at your cloud infrastructure and the bursting from a compute standpoint, and having really strong tools like TensorBoard. We're able to look at all of these projects in flight in a single pane of glass and really monitor their output. So this today is a very human sport, and it requires a bunch of different skill sets. Once you actually get the model into production, you have a different set of skill sets to make sure that these capabilities are surviving and thriving. And there's another really important component here. You can call it corporate responsibility, you can call it ethics. There's things like governance and bias and fairness. There is this whole new can of worms that we are opening up when using machine learning models, making sure that the data we are training the models isn't biased, so the output isn't biased. And we are understanding how we are using data and making sure that we are using that information in an ethical way that doesn't violate people's desires or privacy issues. So, we're big fans of the work that IBM is doing on the AI trust and fairness side. And what you see to the right is a representation of some of their work that they are producing to actually create a technology solution for bias and fairness, and make sure that the data set is in fact, very fair to people of all different diversity circles. But, conceptually, what we should be very cognizant of are key areas when we're talking about our AI program. Are we being fair? Are we using AI in an ethical way? And the more we use AI, is it going to be counter to the needs of our team or our people, or ultimately the livelihood of certain individuals? Are we being very transparent in how we are leveraging the technology? Do we have good dialogue? Do we make sure that everyone is on board? Is there transparency in our own models? When our models are making decisions, can we ask why? Can we interrogate them? Are they explainable? But ultimately, having some level of management and accountability, know how you will use AI, know how you won't use AI, and is it aligned to your corporate values? Because there are threats coming, right? And right now, what's very top of mind for many people is the use of computer vision, specifically in policing. That's one threat. Another threat is automation. Automation is a very real thing. It's been going on for a very long time, but artificial intelligence is enabling another level of automation, where according to another McKinsey report, it could potentially replace 75 to 375 million jobs by 2030. So 3 to 14% of the global workforce, or 40% of US jobs by 2050. So if you look to the right, what you are seeing is what they predict as the percentage of the job AI can replace in that time frame. So if you look at the 99%ers, you have areas like data entry, taxes, telemarketers, fashion models, very interesting, legal secretaries. Mostly automated are auditors, masons, butchers, and predominantly automated are areas like tour guides, auto technicians, and taxi drivers. The list goes on. And what's interesting to note here, where from a business standpoint, this could be quite exciting, but from a people standpoint, it's quite scary. And trying to understand how will I and where will I automate, if I will automate at all. Will I replace people, or am I more interested in augmenting those people, automating some of their tasks so they're free to take on other tasks versus reducing headcount or hours? And ultimately, at the end of the day, is where am I going to apply this technology in a place where my employees who could be automated have the opportunity to upskill or cross-train on a new role, so their job is safe, but they're learning something new, or they're just learning to work with the machine. These are all questions that we're going to have to answer, particularly to just automation. But again, there's many issues to think through. So it's a big lift. There's a lot to think about. At the end of the day, AI doesn't deliver value just by crunching data and delivering outputs. It delivers value when the organization can fundamentally change its behavior. So we need both, right? We need the technology and we need the organizational mindset and change to really allow these two things to draft one another and create exponential gains. So to sum everything up, this is just a quick recap of what the AI Center of Excellence looks like. We have this hub and spoke model where the hub is established through strategy, centrally managed by some sort of chief AI officer or C-level executive who's going to be championing this across the organization. So we have tight alignment between our AI strategy and our corporate strategy, but also great ways to measure the success of that strategy, test and learn, and get access to data resources. Someone who could, when arguments between the CMO and CIO happen over data, someone who could basically come and get these two working together. And ultimately, we're going to see a lot of our capability being embedded into existing structures we have today, where we might have central management, but these individuals and processes are federated across the business. So we have better subject matter expertise. We have people closer to the trenches or the realities of the users of the machine learning model, or our customers who would be benefiting from the machine learning model, and ultimately have tight operations that connect the nodes between the data science, the operations, the DevOps, et cetera. So that's it. I will open things up for questions. There's a lot here. It's a meaty subject. Hopefully it was informational, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. So for folks who have questions, please submit them either in the Q&A or the chat. Both work. And one thing I forgot to mention at the top is we will provide a recording of this. So like Steve said, there's a lot here. So if you want to go back and check something, you'll have the ability to do that, as well as we have the white paper available as well if you want to just spend some time with it, review it, and maybe come back to it. So while folks are submitting questions, I'll start with a few that we got during the slides. So one person asked you, the hub and spoke model is a really interesting framework. Have you seen that in practice yet?
The closest place I've seen this to the theory that we are all talking about and publishing on is at Facebook. So there's some really good examples of how Facebook organizes their data science team. So they have a chief data officer, but every data scientist that Facebook employs is both accountable to their CDO, but is also accountable and federated and embedded inside the business unit that they serve. It provides them easier access to the data, obviously the business goals that they're trying to solve for, and certainly the subject matter expertise around the information which they're trying to solve for. So I think they do a really good job of representing how it can be. Now, Facebook is an example of one of the largest businesses in the world. Keep in mind, some of these things change with the size of business. This becomes more important the bigger you are. When you're a smaller organization, more in the middle market, I think this is still important, but the necessity of it changes quite a bit.
Great. Another question, can KUNGFU.AI help assess the total investment and return on that investment of an AI initiative? All these roles to hire would introduce a cost for an unknown lead time before the strategy begins to produce value.
Yes, caveat. So I think it's really, we did a webinar on this. Whoever asked that question, I would love for you just to reach out and I can send you a webinar. And what's interesting even about the webinar is we're putting so much thinking around this. I think there's probably additional content I can share with you as well. But it's very important to understand with an ROI case, generally, can a KUNGFU.AI or services agency be the ones that really drive that calculation? Short answer is yes. The caveat is that there's different types of business cases and ROI cases, and you need to understand the difference between strategic ROI or strategic business case versus financial ROI or a financial business case. Whereas the strategic business case is actually the place you should start and easier to do. The financial ROI can actually be quite difficult, and certain consultancies, the big ones, can charge hundreds of thousands of dollars to get to a really effective financial ROI metric. I don't think you need to necessarily even go that far, but I think you do need to understand the complexity of developing a really well-pointed financial ROI model and the importance of also focusing on, in the near term, the strategic ROI model. There's a lot there. I could probably do another talk on that. I did. So I'll leave it at that for now. Hopefully that's helpful.
Absolutely. So if you wanted to look within to potentially hire your chief AI officer, where would be a good place within your organization to look for that person?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question, because depending on your business, they realistically can come from anywhere. I think it's likely you're going to find that individual these days more represented on the IT side. And the only reason why I say that is that you're just going to see more people go in the direction of technical and then learn more of the business than people that spend the time to get the MBA and then get their second master's in computer science, for example. That's changing. I just think it's a numbers game. So again, you're going to want to find someone who, and you don't need an MBA. Let me caveat that as well to be able to do this well. But someone on the technical side who checks that box, and it's important they can check that box or be technical enough to make sure that the organization doesn't fall into traps on taking on capabilities that have a long tail development effort, but will never actually produce what we hope that they would produce. They're able to see ahead and see around corners, but ultimately can communicate to the organization. They can bridge gaps between different departments. They can get people to cooperate and really have great ideas on how to creatively apply this technology to solve some pretty pervasive challenges that the business is facing. So I think I would look for some of those things. I think if you turned over rocks, you might have greater success looking on the technical side, but really they could be anywhere.
Makes sense. So do you always need to set a strategy, or does it ever make sense just to start with a really small little use case?
That's also a great question. Honestly, I think you can do both, but you need to temper your expectations. I think there is value in this experimental model of artificial intelligence, but I think we do have to kind of fail our way to success when it comes to this thing. And I encourage people to get hands-on. And sometimes part of the education process is getting hands-on and trying and succeeding, or trying and failing and learning from those successes and failures. The first thing I led with is you have to be educated. We have to be educated from the top down. And if it's required for you to experiment and launch things to do that, great. But if you see AI as the long-term vision of being able to work this thing as a core function of the business, similar to how we're seeing Google take an AI-first posture, or other large organizations like Progressive Insurance employing 200 data science and machine learning engineers, they have a clear vision, they're executing, and they're winning. To get to that level, you want to have that strategy in place. So I think that the experimentation is a great way to gain momentum, gain trust from the executives, and begin to educate yourself. And once you can get that quick win out there, if that's required to achieve that goal, then go ahead and do strategy. But don't think that you're going to be able to really win just doing a bunch of onesies and twosies and hope that eventually this kind of organically just falls into motion at a certain point in time. I think we've worked with so many clients who have failed that way, that we're really trying to change that paradigm and getting them to take a step back and really connect the technology to where the business needs to go.
Mm-hmm. And as sort of a follow-up to that, what are the groups that need to be in the room when I set the AI strategy?
Yes, so certainly someone who's going to be your executive sponsor. So any sort of C-level who's going to champion this technology, and they're excited about it because they've already connected the dot between this technology is going to be an enabler for us to achieve the goal, which I'm accountable to, and I can champion at the highest level, and I can ultimately get funding authority at the end of the day. So you have your executive sponsor can come anywhere across the C-suite. It may not make sense to start in marketing, but anywhere else for various reasons, but someone who also has some clout amongst it. It's not the CEO, someone who has clout with the CEO, the CFO, et cetera. Then you're going to want to make sure that you have representation from technology, and that technology can be top-level engineers. It could additionally be the CIO, but ultimately these people are going to know how systems work, where the data resides, and ultimately what can and cannot happen to unlock that data. If you're so sophisticated to even have a data science team, certainly bring them as well. It's so fascinating. We run our strategy workshops. We'll put data scientists who are building capabilities currently in the same room as executives. And when we break from these workshops, they're thanking us because they're saying, I never knew why I was doing what I was doing, which is so fascinating and scary at the same time. So being able to put all these people in the room together, as well as anyone who might be inheriting the technology. Hey, I'm a manager of a sales team of 100, and we're going to be creating them a new forecasting model, right? Well, are those salespeople upset with their current forecasting model? Do they know how to use the new forecasting model? If the forecast is bad, are they going to trust it? So you want to make sure all those people are represented in the room, have a heads up, have a voice, and make sure that we're rolling out a pretty successful capability.
Great. All right. Well, unless there's any other questions, then I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. And we'll be making the recording and slides available, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you, everyone. You're a great audience. I had a lot of fun, and hopefully this was helpful.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.